Eisenhower's presidency was very successful, to the point that had he ran for a third term, he almost definitely would have won. However, we had passed the 22nd Amendment. Well, Republicans actually passed the 22nd Amendment, making it, or limiting presidents to 2 terms. They did that, obviously, in response to FDR. But it comes back and bites them in the butt. Eisenhower could have won a third term, so could Ronald Reagan. So it's a law of unintended consequences. Most people are reactionary rather than thinking forward. And so Eisenhower was not able to run again. Instead, Republicans will nominate his vice president, Richard M. Nixon. It's interesting how much Eisenhower disliked Nixon. Nixon had made his career on what's called red baiting, calling all of his enemies communist, and Eisenhower just didn't like that. He didn't like Nixon, and he made it very clear. At one point during the election, a journalist went to Eisenhower and said, "Can you tell me something that Nixon did that led to some important policies during your administration?" Eisenhower thought for a moment and said, "I don't know, I'll have to get back to you in a week." And that was the story. Eisenhower says Nixon didn't help him. The most atrocious story that makes you feel really bad for Nixon. Eisenhower was having a party at his house one time, and there were like 50 guests, and they're all standing outside, socializing, drinking. It starts getting late, and the sun starts going down. And so Eisenhower goes around to every person there, puts his hand on their shoulder, says, "Hey, why don't you join me inside so we can continue the evening? Why don't you come inside so we can continue our party inside?" He goes person to person, to every other person except Nixon. Everyone else goes inside. Nixon's just standing there by himself. And then he just, put his head down and went home. You've got to feel a little bit bad for that. The Democrats will nominate John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was young, he was very handsome, he had a lot of energy, and he was incredibly intelligent and very charismatic. He will run on the idea that the United States was adrift and it needed new, young, vigorous energy. And that is what he will run on, is energizing the country. He also was a Catholic, which was very controversial, even in the 1960s. And as his running mate, he will bring in a guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson, if you remember, was from Texas. He had been head of the NYA, National Youth Association, during the New Deal. And the reason Johnson was brought on was because, one, he was important and powerful in the Senate. He had been in politics for a while, and he was very, very good in Congress at getting people to do what he wanted, but also because he was from Texas. The Kennedy family are associated with Massachusetts, so it's a way to balance the ticket. These two hated each other, though. They really, really disliked each other. Now, what's notable about the election of 1960 is it's the first presidential election that had televised debates. Richard Nixon, he was really, really smart. He was incredibly intelligent, and he had been a really good debater in college. So he spent weeks studying and preparing for this debate. Not realizing the importance of it being televised. Kennedy understood the importance of it being televised. So Kennedy, to prepare, mostly lay in the sun to work on his tan. When the debate happened, and to this day, if you asked debate experts who won, they all say Nixon won. But the majority of the U.S. population are not debate experts. If you ask, or most people that listened to the debate over the radio also say Nixon won. But the majority of the population that watched the televised debates say Kennedy won because he looked better. He looked calmer, he looked cooler. Nixon, he looked like ragged, like he had been studying all week, which he had been. His aides even tried to put makeup on him because he looked so exhausted, and he shooed him away, said, "Get away from me, that doesn't matter." And so it was a huge mistake on his part. And he will end up losing, but it was insanely close. The election of 1960 is one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Kennedy will win by 0.2%. And the only reason he won, well, not the only reason, a big reason he won is because massive cheating. If you wanted to talk about an election where there's definitely cheating, the election of 1960. And there was cheating all over the place. Texas had the most flagrant cheating. Probably the only reason Nixon and his campaign didn't make a bigger deal about the cheating is because they were cheating too. It really came down to who were better at cheating. So it was an incredibly close election. Kennedy will be elected, and take note of this because I've seen this on a game show. He is the youngest person to ever be elected president. He was 43 at the time. The youngest person to ever be president was Teddy Roosevelt, who became president when McKinley was assassinated. Kennedy is the youngest person to ever be elected president. And he will have to deal with a lot of very important Cold War issues, starting with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, he inherited this from the Eisenhower administration. The CIA had plans to overthrow Fidel Castro by training and arming a bunch of Cuban exiles. The idea was they were going to invade, and they were going to unite the people of Cuba and overthrow the Castro government. And it was a bad idea for all sorts of reasons, especially because it was contingent on the people of Cuba wanting to overthrow Fidel Castro. And why they thought that the people of Cuba would want that is just a mystery. The United States will have its fingerprints all over this. The United States provided enough support and resources to make it very clear that this was a U.S. invasion, but did not provide enough to make sure it was successful. They asked for like planes and or helicopter and reinforcements, stuff like that, and the United States doesn't go that far. So the whole thing is an unmitigated failure, and the people of Cuba did not get closer to, or did not turn against Fidel Castro. But there are several important things about this. First, it led to Operation Mongoose, and that is the CIA attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. If you go to Washington, D.C., there is a spy museum, and it shows all of the ways they tried to assassinate him, and it really gets into Bugs Bunny territory. They've tried exploding cigars. The CIA will destroy sugar plantations to make the people hurt economically, so they'll turn against them. They did all sorts of things to try to get rid of Fidel Castro. Later on in the 90s and before Fidel Castro died, there were people wondered why he was so paranoid, and he was paranoid for a very, very good reason. The U.S. was actively trying to assassinate him for decades. So, what does Fidel Castro do? Throughout the Cold War, there are two world powers, and when the United States turns against someone, it pushes those individuals to go to the Soviet Union for help, and that's what happened. Fidel Castro will get closer to the Soviet Union because of this. None of this, all the problems with Cuba did not have to happen. It wasn't necessary. If the United States had viewed it as a third world country that was impoverished, needed economic assistance, and not treated it immediately like it's an enemy, then all the problems with Cuba, not all of them, but there could have been better relationships with Cuba throughout this entire period. Very importantly, the Bay of Pigs invasion, when it came out, actually helped JFK. JFK's approval rating actually went up. That tells you how Americans viewed the world during this period. The thing that was most important to Americans was being tough on communism no matter what. So even though this was a failed attempt, Americans actually gave JFK higher approval ratings because he at least tried something. And that is fairly consistent throughout a lot of the Cold Wars. Americans just want presidents to do something. Most importantly, though, the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Mongoose, pushing Fidel Castro closer to the Soviet Union, led to the scariest point of the entire Cold War. When U.S. planes found out that there were missile silos being built in Cuba. U.S. spy planes found out that the Soviet Union was putting missile silos in Cuba, and this is America's backyard. So if Cuba has missiles, then it would be able to drop a nuclear weapon on Washington, D.C. This is one of those periods where Kennedy will handle this incredibly well, and he really handles this well. He is strong and firm, but doesn't go too far. Cuban Missile Crisis, were this period, if you know anyone that lived through it, they will remember it very clearly because people were convinced, oh, this is the end. This is when we all evaporate and we're going to nuke ourselves out of existence. Kennedy ordered a blockade around Cuba. So now U.S. naval ships are surrounding Cuba and not letting any ships in or out. And the Soviets already had ships on the way. So you had a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was absolutely terrifying. Again, to Kennedy's credit, he handled this very firmly, but didn't go overboard. And he contacted Eisenhower several times to get advice. So amazingly, the Soviet Union backed down. Well, Soviet Union will back down is what I used to teach throughout most of my career, what most historians have taught, and agree not to put nuclear weapons in Cuba in exchange for the United States agreeing not to invade Cuba. Now, the reason I say this is what we've taught is because in the last couple of years, it turns out that actually Kennedy agreed to remove nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles from Turkey. So the United States said, you're not putting nuclear weapons in our backyard, and the Soviet Union said, okay, well then you take them out of our backyard. So the United States will agree and remove their nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Now, this was not public information until just the last few years. Just the last few years we found out about it because Kennedy made sure that that part of the agreement didn't get out. Because, again, what Americans wanted was for the president to be tough on communism. And so the United States got their nuclear weapons out of Soviet Union's backyard, and this was a very intense period probably the most intense period of the entire Cold War. Now, Kennedy had barely won the election in 1960. Kennedy had barely won the election in 1960, and by 1963, he was gearing up for the next presidential election in 1964. He was having a lot of problems with his own party because he supported civil rights, which we will talk about later. He supported the civil rights movement, which was very unpopular to a lot of Southern Democrats. That is why, in November of 1963, he traveled down to Texas. And that is why he was in Dallas, Texas. He was trying to shore up support from Democrats for his reelection. And as we all know, he is shot and assassinated. Now, a couple things about this. First, there are people that say, you hear somewhat regularly, that he is listed as one of the top 10 best presidents. I don't think there's any justifiable way you can make that case because he wasn't around long enough. He didn't have enough time. Now, the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, both parties, he gets praise for the way he handled that from all sides. And he had the potential to be a phenomenal president, but he just wasn't president long enough. So I don't think it's accurate to say he's in the top 10 greatest presidents. He might have been, but we just will never know. Another thing about his assassination is that is the single most successful conspiracy theory in U.S. history. When I say single most successful, I believe somewhere around 75% of Americans think it was not Lee Harvey Oswald that did it. And I could give an entire lecture on just the JFK conspiracy and like what all the conspiracy theory and how the conspiracy theory grew. You won't be tested on this, but it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. There's actually books on Americans and conspiracy theories, and also there's a lot of psychology research on conspiracy theories, and Americans love conspiracy theories. A big reason for that is because if it was the government, if it was the CIA, if it was LBJ, if it was Mafia, Castro, whatever, whoever it was, we would rather believe it's an internal, we would rather have some certainty. It's an internal conspiracy rather than the sheer randomness. Because the randomness is uncertainty, and humans' brains just aren't geared towards uncertainty. We will do everything to avoid uncertainty, because throughout, the way our brains function is if we are uncertain about it, then it could kill us. That's one of the reasons you see people stay in terrible relationships for a long time, because it provides, even if it's bad, it still provides a level of comfort. And that security and certainty is much more preferable than the uncertainty, but you won't be tested on that. Instead, I'll give you a random fact that is interesting. There's something called Tecumseh's Revenge. Now, there's a Native American named Tecumseh, and he tried to start an Indian uprising, and it was put down at the Battle of Tippecanoe by a guy named William Henry Harrison. As the story goes, Tecumseh supposedly cursed the Great White Father. And William Henry Harrison is the first president that dies in office. He was, I believe he was 68 when he was elected, and he still has the record for the longest inaugural address. It was like an hour and 45 minutes. He was standing outside without a jacket, and he caught a cold. He also has the record for the shortest presidency. He only lived 1 month. He was only president for 1 month. After William Henry Harrison, though, every president that is elected in a year ending in 0 will die in office. That's what Tecumseh's revenge is. Starting with William Henry Harrison, every 20 years, president elected in a year ending 0 will die in office. He was elected in 1840, 1860, obviously Abraham Lincoln. 1880, James A. Garfield was killed because of the spoil system. 1900, William McKinley, killed by a deranged anarchist. 1920, Warren G. Harding died on a trip out to Alaska. 1940, FDR will die in office. 1960, JFK. 1980, Ronald Reagan, really early in his presidency, was shot, and he got so close to dying, but was saved by modern medicine. Modern medicine kept him alive. 2000, there's a lot of historians that were just absolutely curious. Did Reagan break Tecumseh's revenge? Is it over? And the worst George W. had was a shoe thrown at his head, so I suppose so. Random fact, if you want to memorize the presidents, it's a good way to have to remember the 20 years, and then you can fill in between, and also just impress people at dinner parties. Kennedy's death brought LBJ to the presidency, of course.